She served tables to pay for her grandmother's care. He was worth $50 million. When he tried to humiliate her in German, he didn't know she spoke 7 languages. The lunch rush at La Fontaine had finally settled into a manageable rhythm when Natalia Reyes noticed the 2 men being escorted to table 12. She recognized the type immediately. Expensive suits tailored to perfection, confident strides, the kind of self-assured posture that came from decades of people saying yes to every request. The older one, silver-haired with sharp blue eyes, walked slightly ahead, as if the world naturally parted for him. His companion followed half a step behind, deferential but comfortable in his own success. Margaret Chen, the restaurant manager, personally seated them, which told Natalia everything she needed to know about their importance. La Fontaine wasn't just any restaurant. It was where the city's elite came to close deals, celebrate victories, and remind themselves of their status. The white tablecloths were imported from Belgium. The wine list featured bottles that cost more than Natalia's monthly rent, and the staff was trained to be invisible until needed. Natalia had been working here for 8 months now, ever since her grandmother Eleanor's health had taken a sharp decline. The medical bills accumulated faster than her translation work could cover, and La Fontaine paid well for servers who could maintain composure under any circumstance. What they didn't know, what almost no one knew, was that Natalia held a master's degree in international relations from Georgetown, had worked as a junior diplomat at the United Nations, and spoke 7 languages fluently: English, Spanish, German, French, Mandarin, Portuguese, and Italian. But diplomas didn't pay for experimental cardiac treatments. Pride didn't keep her grandmother alive. So Natalia tied her hair back, put on the crisp white blouse and black apron that marked her as staff, and served people who often looked right through her. Margaret approached her station near the kitchen. Table 12 needs you. Victor Ashworth and Thomas Brennan. Ashworth is the CEO of Meridian Capital, major investor in half the developments downtown. Whatever they want, make it happen. Of course, Natalia replied with a practiced smile. She gathered her notepad and approached the table with measured steps. Victor Ashworth was studying the menu with the disinterested air of someone who had eaten at finer establishments around the world. His companion Thomas seemed more engaged, actually reading through the appetizer selections. Good afternoon, gentlemen. Welcome to La Fontaine. My name is Natalia, and I'll be taking care of you today. May I start you with something from our wine list or perhaps some sparkling water? Victor didn't look up from the menu. Bring us the 2018 Chateau Margaux, and make sure it's properly decanted. I don't have patience for amateurs who can't handle wine correctly. Excellent choice, sir. I'll have that prepared immediately. She turned to leave, but Victor's voice stopped her. Wait. He finally looked at her, his eyes moving from her face to her name tag, with an assessing gaze that made her feel like merchandise being evaluated. You're new here, aren't you? I've been with La Fontaine for 8 months, sir. 8 months. He exchanged a glance with Thomas that carried some private meaning. And before that? What qualifies someone to serve at an establishment like this? Natalia kept her smile steady. She had learned that certain wealthy clients enjoyed these small demonstrations of power, reminding service workers of their place in the hierarchy. I received extensive training in wine service, fine dining protocols, and guest relations. La Fontaine has very high standards for their staff. High standards? Victor repeated with a slight smirk. I'm sure. He waved his hand dismissively. The wine. Quickly. Right away, sir. As she walked toward the sommelier station, Natalia felt the familiar heat of suppressed frustration. She had presented trade proposals to ambassadors, negotiated cultural exchanges between nations, and once spent 3 hours discussing economic policy with a German chancellor in flawless German. Now she fetched wine for men who couldn't be bothered to make eye contact. But Eleanor needed her. That was all that mattered. She returned with the wine, properly decanted, and presented it with the reverence the vintage deserved. Victor barely acknowledged the service, immediately launching into conversation with Thomas. The Frankfurt group is hesitant, Thomas was saying. Their lead negotiator keeps insisting on better terms. Germans, Victor scoffed. Always so rigid about everything. Numbers, contracts, procedures. No flexibility whatsoever. Natalia poured the wine with practiced grace, her hand steady despite the conversation happening over her head. What they need is someone who speaks their language, not just the words, the mentality. Have you ever tried to negotiate with a German, Thomas? It's like talking to a calculator. They can be challenging, Thomas said diplomatically. Victor took a sip of wine, nodded his approval, then looked directly at Natalia. You can go now, we'll signal when we need you. Of course, sir, enjoy. She retreated to her station but remained attentive. Other tables needed service. Mrs. Patterson at table 4 was celebrating her 40th anniversary and wanted champagne recommendations. The Hendersons at table 7 had brought their elderly mother for her birthday and asked Natalia to coordinate a surprise dessert. These moments made the job bearable, genuine human connection that reminded her why she had once wanted to make the world better through diplomacy. Between courses, she couldn't help overhearing Victor's conversation. He spoke loudly, as wealthy men often did. The waitstaff here, he was saying to Thomas. Perfect example of what's wrong with the service industry. No ambition, no drive. They're content to carry plates and smile while people like us actually create value in the world. Thomas shifted uncomfortably. They're just doing their jobs, Victor. Exactly my point. Just doing their jobs. No imagination, no aspiration. They wake up, they serve, they go home to their little apartments, and they never think about anything bigger. Victor's voice carried a cruel edge. Look at our waitress. Pretty enough, pleasant smile. Probably thinks her life is fulfilling because she can recommend a decent Bordeaux. Does she have any idea what it takes to build something? To matter. Natalia's grip tightened on the coffee cup she was preparing. Smile. Remain calm. Don't engage. Her phone buzzed silently in her apron pocket. A text from Eleanor's day nurse. Your grandmother had a good morning. She ate all her breakfast and asked about you. Doctor says the new medication is helping, but we need to schedule follow-up tests next week. The follow-up tests, another expense, another bill. But Eleanor had raised her after her parents died in a car accident when Natalia was 7. Eleanor had taught her Spanish, encouraged her to study abroad, celebrated every academic achievement with homemade cake and tears of pride. Now it was Natalia's turn to take care of her. Table 12's appetizers were ready. She delivered them with practiced efficiency. Is there anything else I can bring you, gentlemen? Victor looked at his plate, then back at her. I'm curious about something. Where did you go to school? I have a bachelor's degree in international studies from Georgetown University, sir. Victor's eyebrows rose. Georgetown, and you're serving tables? The hospitality industry has been very welcoming to me. Welcoming? Victor laughed dismissively. What a waste. Did you fail out of everything else, run out of options? My circumstances changed. Life doesn't always follow our planned paths. Life follows the paths we make for it. That's the difference between people like me and people like you. I built Meridian Capital from nothing. $50 million in personal assets. He speared a scallop with his fork. You had advantages. Georgetown isn't cheap and you ended up here. That tells me everything I need to know. Thomas looked uncomfortable. Victor, maybe we should focus on lunch. No, this is interesting. A Georgetown graduate bringing me my lunch. Victor chewed thoughtfully. Tell me, what languages did they teach you? Any practical skills? I studied several languages, sir. The program emphasized practical application in diplomatic contexts. Several languages? Victor smiled coldly. Let me guess. Spanish, because everyone learns Spanish. Maybe French, because it sounds sophisticated. Anything actually useful? I believe all languages are useful, sir. They connect us to different perspectives and cultures. Perspectives and cultures, Victor repeated mockingly. See, Thomas? This is what universities produce now. People who talk about perspectives instead of results. He laughed. In the real world, connections are about money and power. Languages are tools for getting what you want from people. Nothing more. He waved dismissively. You can go. I'm sure other tables need your perspectives on culture. She walked away with measured steps. In the kitchen, she paused by the water station. You okay? Asked David, the sous chef. Fine, just a challenging table. Table 12. Yeah, Ashworth comes in monthly. Never tips more than 10%. Always finds something to complain about. Some people think money makes them royalty. As she prepared to return to the floor, she heard something that stopped her cold. Victor's voice, speaking German. Thomas, schau dir diese Kellnerin an. Sie denkt, sie sei etwas Besonderes, weil sie auf einer teuren Universität war. Aber am Ende des Tages ist sie nur ein dummes Mädchen, das Teller trägt. Thomas, look at this waitress. She thinks she's something special because she went to an expensive university. But at the end of the day, she's just a stupid girl carrying plates. Natalia froze. He was speaking German, assuming she couldn't understand. Testing her, perhaps. or simply enjoying freedom to say what he really thought. Thomas responded in halting German. Victor, das ist nicht nett. Victor, that's not nice. Nett? Wer redet von nett? Victor laughed. Sie versteht uns sowieso nicht. Das ist das Schöne daran, eine andere Sprache zu sprechen. Man kann die Wahrheit sagen, direkt vor ihren Gesichtern. Nice. Who's talking about nice? She doesn't understand us anyway. That's the beauty of speaking another language. You can tell the truth right in front of their faces. Natalia's hands trembled. She understood every word, every dismissive syllable, every cruel assumption. He thought German created an invisible barrier, allowing him to mock her openly while she stood oblivious and servile. She thought of Eleanor, who had learned German as a diplomat's wife in Berlin, who had taught Natalia through bedtime stories and old films. Eleanor, who believed language was a bridge, not a weapon. Eleanor fighting for her life while Natalia served men who saw her as less than human. Her training told her to stay calm. Her job depended on not reacting, but there were limits. She straightened her apron, took a deep breath, and walked toward table 12. Victor was still talking, his German flowing freely now. Und die Art, wie sie sich bewegt, als wäre sie wichtig. Diese Dienstmädchen sind alle gleich. Lächeln und hoffen auf ein gutes Trinkgeld, während sie zu dumm sind zu erkennen, dass sie nie etwas Besseres sein werden. And the way she moves, as if she were important. These servant girls are all the same, smiling and hoping for a good tip, while being too stupid to realize they'll never be anything better. Natalia stopped at their table. Victor glanced up, ready to dismiss her again. Instead, she spoke. Entschuldigen Sie, mein Herr, ich konnte nicht umhin zu bemerken, dass Sie offenbar einige Missverständnisse über mich haben. Vielleicht könnte ich einige davon klären? Excuse me, sir. I couldn't help but notice you seem to have some misunderstandings about me. Perhaps I could clarify. Victor's face went white. His fork clattered against his plate. Thomas's mouth fell open. Victor recovered quickly, but his composure was clearly shaken. You speak German? Fließend, Natalia replied with a slight smile. Als auch Spanisch, Französisch, Mandarin, Portugiesisch und Italienisch. 7 Sprachen insgesamt, falls Sie mitzählen. Fluently, as well as Spanish, French, Mandarin, Portuguese and Italian. 7 languages total if you're counting. The color drained from Victor's face. For perhaps the first time in decades, he was completely speechless. And Natalia, standing tall in her server's apron, felt something she hadn't experienced since her diplomatic days. The quiet power of truth, spoken at exactly the right moment. The other diners hadn't noticed the exchange. The conversation had been too quiet, too intimate for the surrounding tables to hear. But Thomas was staring at Victor, with an expression that combined shock and something else. Something that looked almost like satisfaction at seeing his arrogant friend finally caught off guard. Victor's mouth opened, then closed. His silver tongue, so quick with insults moments before, had abandoned him entirely. The silence stretched between them like a taut wire. Victor Ashworth, a man who had negotiated deals worth hundreds of millions of dollars, who had stared down hostile boardrooms and emerged victorious, found himself utterly disarmed by a waitress in a white apron. How? He began, then stopped. His face cycled through several emotions, shock, embarrassment, anger, before settling on defensive arrogance. That's quite a party trick. Where did you pick up German? Some community college course. I learned it from my grandmother, Natalia replied evenly, her voice carrying a quiet dignity that seemed to fill the space around them. She was a translator for the diplomatic corps in Berlin for 23 years. She believed that every language opens a door to understanding another culture, another way of seeing the world. Thomas leaned forward, his expression shifting from shock to genuine interest. 7 languages, that's remarkable. Most people struggle with 2. It requires dedication, Natalia acknowledged. But my grandmother always said that languages are gifts we give ourselves. Each one reveals something new about human experience. Victor's jaw tightened. He wasn't accustomed to being the one at a disadvantage, and the sensation clearly didn't sit well with him. Well, congratulations on your linguistic achievements, but I fail to see what that has to do with anything. You're still a waitress. Yes, Natalia agreed. I am, and there's nothing shameful about that. I didn't say there was. You said I was a stupid girl carrying plates. You said I would never be anything better. You said these things in German because you assumed I wouldn't understand, that I was too uneducated, too beneath you to comprehend anything beyond basic English. Victor's face flushed red. I was having a private conversation. In a public restaurant about a person standing within earshot. That's not private, Mr. Ashworth. That's simply rude. Thomas actually laughed. A short, surprised sound that he quickly suppressed when Victor shot him a glare. But Natalia caught the ghost of a smile on his face, and something shifted in the dynamic at the table. Perhaps, Natalia continued, we should start this interaction over. I'm Natalia Reyes. I hold a master's degree in international relations from Georgetown University. I worked for 3 years as a junior diplomat with the United Nations, specializing in cultural liaison work between Western and Asian economic delegations. I speak 7 languages because effective diplomacy requires understanding people on their own terms in their own words. Victor opened his mouth to respond, but Natalia wasn't finished. I'm working at La Fontaine because my grandmother, the woman who raised me after my parents died and taught me everything I know about language and grace and treating people with dignity, is currently fighting heart disease. Her medical treatment costs more than my diplomatic salary could cover, so I took a job where I could earn more while maintaining a flexible schedule for hospital visits and doctor's appointments. She paused, letting her words settle into the air between them. The nearby tables had begun to notice something unusual happening, not the words themselves, which were too quiet to carry far, but the tension, the stillness, the unusual sight of a server standing so confidently before wealthy patrons. Every person you encounter has a story you don't know, Mr. Ashworth. The busboy clearing your plates might be a music student working his way through conservatory. The hostess seating guests might be raising 3 children alone while pursuing a nursing degree. The assumptions you make about people based on their uniforms or their jobs say far more about you than about them. Victor sat in stunned silence. His expensive suit, his confident posture, his silver hair that usually commanded respect, none of it seemed to matter in this moment. He had been stripped of his usual armor, exposed as someone who used wealth and language as weapons against those he considered inferior. Thomas spoke into the silence. Natalia, I apologize for what my colleague said. It was inexcusable. Thank you, she replied, but the apology should come from Mr. Ashworth. Victor's eyes narrowed. You're seriously expecting me to apologize to a waitress for a private conversation? I'm expecting you to recognize that what you said was cruel and unnecessary. Whether you apologize is your choice, but I've learned that how people treat service workers reveals their true character far more accurately than how they behave with their peers. Margaret appeared at the edge of their section, her expression concerned. She had clearly noticed the unusual interaction and was preparing to intervene. Natalia caught her eye and gave a small nod. She had this under control. Victor seemed to struggle with himself for a long moment. His pride was clearly warring with something else, perhaps the recognition that he had been caught behaving badly, perhaps genuine shame at his words being thrown back at him. He began, then stopped, started again. Perhaps I was hasty in my judgments. That's not an apology, Natalia said calmly. Fine. Victor's voice was tight. I apologize for what I said. It was inappropriate. Thank you. I accept your apology. Natalia paused. Would you like me to continue serving your table, or would you prefer another server be assigned? The question hung in the air. Victor could easily demand another server, could complain to management, could make Natalia's life difficult, but something in his expression shifted. A flicker of respect, perhaps, or simply the recognition that he had already lost whatever game he thought he was playing. No, you can continue. Very well, I'll check on your entrees shortly. Natalia turned to leave, then paused. Oh, and Mr. Ashworth, the Frankfurt negotiators you mentioned earlier, if they're being difficult about terms, you might try approaching them with more respect for their process-oriented culture. Germans don't respond well to Americans who try to rush decisions or dismiss their concerns as rigidity. Sometimes flexibility means adapting to others, rather than expecting them to adapt to you. She walked away before he could respond, leaving Victor Ashworth with his mouth slightly open and his lunch companion trying very hard not to laugh. In the kitchen, David caught her eye as she passed. Everything okay out there? You were at table 12 for a while. Just a misunderstanding, Natalia said. It's resolved now. But her hands were shaking slightly as she poured herself a glass of water. The adrenaline of the confrontation was wearing off, replaced by the familiar anxiety about consequences. She needed this job. She couldn't afford to lose it over one arrogant customer, no matter how satisfying it had been to put him in his place. Her phone buzzed again. This time it was a voice message from Eleanor's nursing home. She stepped into the break room and pressed play, her heart tightening with worry. "Hi, Natalia. This is Dr. Chen from Riverside Care. Nothing urgent, but I wanted to discuss your grandmother's test results with you. The new medication is helping more than we expected, but there are some additional treatment options I'd like to explore. Please call me when you get a chance." Natalia sat down heavily on the break room chair. Additional treatment options usually meant additional costs. But the phrase, "helping more than we expected," gave her hope. Real hope, not the desperate kind she had been clinging to for months. She thought about Victor Ashworth and his $50 million, his assumptions about what made a person valuable. He measured worth in assets and influence, in the ability to command respect through intimidation and wealth. He had probably never sat in a hospital room watching someone he loved fight for every breath, never calculated whether paying rent or paying for medication was more important, never understood that sometimes the most valuable thing in the world was simply another day with the people who mattered. Natalia had learned that lesson when her parents died. She had been 7 years old, too young to understand death but old enough to feel its weight. Eleanor had taken her in without hesitation, had transformed her grief into purpose, had taught her that love wasn't just a feeling, but a choice you made every day, in small ways and large. The languages had come from that love. Spanish because it was Eleanor's mother tongue, the language she used for lullabies and bedtime prayers. German because they had lived in Berlin when Natalia was a teenager, during Eleanor's final diplomatic posting. French because Eleanor believed every cultured person should speak the language of diplomacy. Mandarin because Natalia had fallen in love with Chinese literature during college. Portuguese and Italian because once you spoke 5 languages, adding more became almost natural. Each language was a gift from Eleanor, a bridge to understanding, a tool for connection rather than division. Now Eleanor lay in a hospital bed, her heart weakening, her mind still sharp but her body failing her. And Natalia served tables at a restaurant where wealthy men spoke German to mock her, never knowing that every word was a needle in her grandmother's legacy. She wiped her eyes, straightened her apron, and returned to the floor. The rest of the lunch service passed without incident. Victor and Thomas finished their meal in relative silence, though Thomas made a point of thanking Natalia warmly when she brought the dessert menu. "The crème brûlée is excellent," she offered. "Our pastry chef trained in Paris." "Thank you, Natalia," Thomas said, and the use of her name felt deliberate, a small gesture of respect that contrasted sharply with how Victor had treated her earlier. Victor remained silent, but Natalia noticed him watching her as she moved between tables. His expression was unreadable, not the arrogant dismissal of before, but something more complicated. Perhaps he was reconsidering his assumptions. Perhaps he was simply plotting his revenge. With men like Victor Ashworth, it was impossible to tell. When they finally asked for the check, Natalia presented it with her usual professional smile. Victor signed without looking at the total, a $100 tip on a $200 meal. She stared at the receipt after they left. It was more than double what he normally tipped, according to David's earlier comment. A guilt payment, perhaps, or an acknowledgement that she had won this particular battle. Margaret approached her as she was clearing the table. "What happened with table 12? Mr. Ashworth's assistant called to say he was very impressed with the service today." Natalia blinked. "Impressed?" She said he mentioned that he'd never been served by someone so knowledgeable and professional. "He apparently wants to book a private dining room for a business dinner next month and specifically requested that you be the server." Natalia didn't know what to make of this information. Victor Ashworth had humiliated her, mocked her in German, and reduced her to nothing more than a stupid girl carrying plates. Now he wanted her specifically for important events. "I'll have to check my schedule," she said carefully. Margaret nodded. "Well, whatever you did, it worked. That man has never complimented the service in the entire time he's been coming here." She paused, studying Natalia's face. "Are you all right?" "I'm fine, just a long shift." But as Margaret walked away, Natalia felt something shifting inside her, a realization that the confrontation with Victor might have consequences she hadn't anticipated. She had stood up for herself, defended her dignity, and somehow emerged not as the villain of the story, but as someone worth noticing. Her phone buzzed one more time. A text from an unknown number. "This is Thomas Brennan. I got your contact information from the restaurant's website. I hope this isn't inappropriate, but I wanted to apologize again for today. and to say that what you did was incredibly impressive. I'd like to hear more about your diplomatic background sometime, if you're open to it. No pressure, no ulterior motives, just genuine admiration." Natalia read the message twice, then tucked her phone back into her apron. The day had taken turns she never could have predicted. She thought about Eleanor, who had always told her that courage creates its own opportunities. Today, standing up to Victor Ashworth had been an act of courage. Whatever came next would unfold in its own time. For now, she had tables to clear and a grandmother to visit after her shift ended. 2 weeks after the incident at La Fontaine, Natalia found herself sitting across from Thomas Brennan at a quiet coffee shop 3 blocks from the hospital. She had been hesitant to accept his invitation, suspicious of wealthy men who suddenly wanted to know more about her life. But Thomas had been persistent in a gentle way, sending thoughtful messages that never demanded anything, only offered conversation and genuine interest. "Tell me about Berlin," he said, wrapping his hands around his cappuccino. "Your grandmother's time there. It must have been fascinating for a teenager." Natalia smiled at the memory. "I was 16 when we moved there. Eleanor was assigned to the American Embassy as a senior translator. She spoke 11 languages by then: German, French, Spanish, Portuguese, Italian, Russian, Mandarin, Japanese, Arabic, Dutch, and English. I thought she was the most remarkable person in the world." 11 languages. Thomas shook his head in amazement. "That's extraordinary." She used to say that languages were like keys to different rooms in the same house. Each one reveals something the others hide. German taught me precision. Every word has a specific weight and purpose. Mandarin taught me patience. The meanings unfold slowly through context and tone. Spanish taught me passion, the language of poets who feel everything deeply. "And what did English teach you?" Natalia considered the question. Adaptability, perhaps. English borrows from everywhere, evolves constantly, refuses to follow its own rules. It's the language of compromise and innovation. Thomas was quiet for a moment, studying her face. "Victor told me about your grandmother's illness. He did some research after your confrontation." Natalia felt a chill run down her spine. "Research?" He was curious. When someone surprises Victor Ashworth, he needs to understand why. Thomas paused. "He found out about your diplomatic career, your resignation to care for Eleanor, the medical bills, all of it. Should I be concerned?" "No." Thomas shook his head firmly. "Victor is many things. Arrogant, dismissive, sometimes cruel, but he's not vindictive. What he found made him uncomfortable, I think. He realized he had mocked someone far more accomplished than he assumed, someone who had sacrificed a promising career to care for family. And what does Victor plan to do with that information? Honestly, I'm not sure, but he hasn't stopped talking about you since that lunch. Not negatively, more like he's trying to figure out how he misjudged you so completely." Thomas smiled. "You rattled him, Natalia. In 30 years of knowing Victor, I've never seen anyone do that." Natalia sipped her coffee thoughtfully. "What's your relationship with him? You seem different from his usual circle." "We went to college together, roommates freshman year at Dartmouth. Victor was already ambitious then, convinced he would change the world through finance. I was studying literature, dreaming of being a novelist." He laughed softly. "Life had other plans for both of us." Natalia's phone buzzed. A message from the hospital. "Eleanor is having a difficult afternoon. She's asking for you." "I have to go," Natalia said, standing quickly. "My grandmother—" "Of course, go." Thomas stood with her. "Natalia, whatever you need, support, resources, anything, please don't hesitate to ask. I mean that sincerely." She looked at him, searching for any sign of manipulation, but found only genuine concern. "Thank you, Thomas. I'll remember that." The hospital was 20 minutes away, but she made it in 15. Eleanor's room was on the 4th floor, a private suite that Natalia could barely afford but refused to compromise on. Her grandmother deserved comfort in these difficult days. Eleanor was sitting up when Natalia arrived, her silver hair brushed and her eyes alert despite the monitors beeping steadily beside her bed. "Mija," Eleanor said, her voice weak but warm. "You didn't have to rush. I just wanted to see your face." Natalia pulled a chair close to the bed and took her grandmother's hand. The skin was paper-thin now, fragile in ways that still surprised her. "How are you feeling today?" "Old," Eleanor smiled. "Tired, but grateful. Dr. Chen says the new medication is helping my heart work more efficiently. Not a cure, but time. More time." That's wonderful news. Time enough to see you happy, perhaps. Eleanor's eyes sharpened with familiar perception. You've been different these past few weeks. Something happened at the restaurant. Natalia shouldn't have been surprised. Eleanor had always been able to read her like a book in any language. There was an incident. A wealthy customer spoke German to mock me, not knowing I understood. I confronted him. Eleanor's eyebrows rose. You confronted a wealthy customer? At work? I couldn't stay silent, Abuela. He called me stupid, said I would never be anything better than a servant. All because I was wearing an apron instead of a business suit. And what happened? I responded in German, told him I spoke 7 languages, that I had worked for the UN, that my grandmother was a diplomatic translator, who taught me that every person deserves respect regardless of their occupation. Eleanor was quiet for a long moment. Then she smiled. A real smile, the kind that transformed her weathered face into something radiant. Good, she said simply. That's exactly what I raised you to do. I was worried you'd be disappointed. I could have lost my job. Mija, dignity is not something you trade for security. Your parents, my daughter and her husband, they taught me that. They could have had comfortable careers staying quiet about injustice, but they chose to speak. That's why they were on that road the night of the accident, driving to a community meeting about housing discrimination. Eleanor's voice caught. They died doing what was right, and you, their child, you carry that same fire. Natalia felt tears threatening. I miss them every day. So do I. But I see them in you. In your courage, your kindness, your refusal to accept cruelty as normal. That man needed someone to remind him that money doesn't make him better than anyone else. You did that. His name is Victor Ashworth. He's apparently a major figure in finance. Eleanor laughed, a soft sound that turned into a cough. Natalia helped her drink water, waited for the moment to pass. Victor Ashworth, Eleanor repeated. I know that name. He donated to the Embassy Cultural Fund in Berlin years ago. Made a big show of it. Even then, people said he was brilliant but cold. She squeezed Natalia's hand. Maybe your words planted a seed. Sometimes that's all we can do, plant seeds and trust they'll grow. They sat together for another hour, talking about small things. Eleanor's favorite nurse, the flowers a patient had sent, memories of Berlin. When Eleanor fell asleep, Natalia stayed by her bedside, watching the steady rise and fall of her grandmother's chest. Eleanor was 78 with a failing heart, and all the medication could only delay, not prevent, the inevitable. But she was still here, still fighting, still teaching. Natalia's phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. This is Victor Ashworth. I obtained your number from Thomas. I'd like to meet with you privately, at your earliest convenience, not at the restaurant, somewhere neutral. There's something I need to discuss with you. Natalia stared at the message. She thought about ignoring it, but curiosity tugged at her, and something Thomas had said echoed in her mind. He hasn't stopped talking about you. She typed a reply. I can meet tomorrow at 3 p.m., Riverside Gardens near the fountain. Public space, 1 hour maximum. His response came within seconds. Agreed. Thank you. The next afternoon found her on the park bench 10 minutes early, watching pigeons cluster near the fountain and young parents push strollers along winding paths. It was a beautiful day, crisp and clear. Victor Ashworth arrived precisely at 3 o'clock. He was dressed more casually than at the restaurant. No suit, just a pressed button-down shirt and tailored slacks. He looked older in the natural light, the lines on his face more pronounced. Thank you for coming, he said, sitting on the opposite end of the bench. I wasn't sure you would. Neither was I. Victor nodded, accepting this honesty. I owe you an explanation. Not an excuse, there isn't one for what I said, but an explanation for why I said it. Natalia waited, letting the silence encourage him to continue. When I was 12 years old, my family lost our apartment. My father had been injured on his janitorial job. Couldn't work, no disability payments. We lived in our car for 6 months while my mother cleaned houses to keep us fed. Victor's voice was flat, reciting facts rather than seeking sympathy. The people whose houses she cleaned, they spoke to her like she was invisible. I watched her dignity erode until she barely spoke above a whisper. He paused, looking at the fountain. I swore I would never be poor again, never be vulnerable, never be the one who got dismissed. And somewhere along the way, I became the person who dismisses others. The very monster I had hated as a child. He turned to face her. What you said about how people treat service workers revealing their true character, it haunted me. You held up a mirror I didn't want to look into, and I saw my mother's employers looking back at me. His voice softened. You were right about everything. And I'm sorry, truly sorry. The apology hung between them, more sincere than anything at the restaurant. Natalia considered it carefully. Why are you telling me this? Because I need you to understand that I'm capable of change, and because I have a proposal that might benefit us both. What kind of proposal? Victor leaned forward slightly. Thomas told me about your grandmother's medical situation. The experimental cardiac therapy Dr. Chen mentioned. It's expensive, not covered by insurance, and has a limited window of effectiveness. Natalia's heart rate quickened. How do you know about Dr. Chen? I've built a career on information, but I'm not here to threaten or manipulate. I want to pay for your grandmother's treatment, all of it, no strings attached. The words landed like physical blows. Why would you do that? Because I can. Because she raised a remarkable woman who had the courage to tell me the truth. And because maybe doing something genuinely good might help me become the person I should have been. Natalia searched for the catch, the hidden agenda, but Victor's expression held only weariness and something that looked almost like hope. I can't accept charity, she said finally. Then think of it as payment for a lesson I badly needed to learn. Victor withdrew an envelope. My foundation has a discretionary fund for medical emergencies. This would be a legitimate grant, properly documented. Natalia didn't take the envelope. I need to think about this. Of course. Take all the time you need. Victor placed the envelope on the bench. But don't let pride cost you something irreplaceable. Your grandmother sounds extraordinary. The world needs her as long as possible. He stood, nodded respectfully, and walked away through the park. Natalia sat for a long time watching the fountain spray catch the afternoon light, wondering what Eleanor would advise her to do. The envelope sat beside her, untouched but impossible to ignore. Inside was the possibility of Eleanor's survival, real, tangible hope, instead of the desperate kind she had been clinging to for months. But accepting meant trusting Victor Ashworth. It meant believing that a man who had called her stupid and worthless could genuinely want to help. It meant admitting that her pride was less important than her grandmother's life. It meant accepting that sometimes help came from the most unexpected places. She picked up the envelope finally. Inside was a foundation check for $300,000, enough to cover Eleanor's treatment and then some. The amount seemed almost unreal, more money than Natalia had ever seen in one place. Natalia's hands trembled. This amount of money could change everything. It could save Eleanor. It could give them both a future. But at what cost? She folded the envelope and tucked it into her purse. The decision didn't have to be made today. She would talk to Eleanor, seek her grandmother's wisdom as she had always done, because some choices were too important to make alone, and Eleanor had always helped her see clearly when the path forward seemed impossible to navigate. That evening, Natalia sat beside Eleanor's hospital bed, the envelope still tucked in her purse like a secret she wasn't ready to share. The monitors beeped their steady rhythm, and Eleanor's breathing was slow but regular. She had been sleeping more lately, the medication making her drowsy even as it helped her heart function more efficiently. When Eleanor finally opened her eyes, she seemed to sense immediately that something had changed. "Misha," she said, her voice clearer than it had been that morning. "You have something to tell me." Natalia smiled despite herself. "How do you always know? I've been reading your face since you were 7 years old. You think you can hide things from me now?" Eleanor reached for her hand. "Tell me." Natalia took a deep breath and told her everything. The meeting with Thomas, the text from Victor, the conversation in the park, the envelope with $300,000 waiting to be deposited. Eleanor listened without interrupting, her expression thoughtful. When Natalia finished, a long silence stretched between them. "You're asking me what to do," Eleanor said finally. "I don't know what to do. Part of me wants to tear up that check and prove that we don't need his charity, but another part of me knows that pride won't save your life." "No," Eleanor agreed. "Pride is a luxury, and sometimes accepting help requires more courage than refusing it. But how can I trust him? He said terrible things about me, about people like us. He used his language skills as a weapon instead of a bridge." Eleanor was quiet for a moment, her eyes distant with memory. "When I was young, working as a translator in the diplomatic corps, I met many powerful people. Some were kind, some were cruel, and some were both, depending on the day, the circumstance, the pressures they faced." She squeezed Natalia's hand. "What I learned is that people are rarely just one thing. They carry contradictions within them. the capacity for cruelty and kindness living side by side. So you think I should accept the money? I think you should ask yourself what this man's motivation really is. Not what he says, but what his actions reveal. Eleanor's gaze sharpened. He researched you. He discovered your background, your sacrifice, my illness. He sought you out, arranged a meeting, offered help with no apparent strings. That takes effort, Mija. That takes intention. But why? Why would someone like Victor Ashworth care about a waitress he insulted? Perhaps because you showed him something he didn't expect. You held up a mirror, as you said, and he saw something ugly. Eleanor smiled gently. Some people run from that reflection. Others try to change what they see. The question is, which kind of person is Victor Ashworth? Natalia thought about Victor's story, his childhood poverty, his mother's humiliation, his transformation into the very monster he had hated. She thought about the weariness in his eyes when he apologized, the genuine regret in his voice. I think he wants to change, she said slowly. I think confronting him shocked him into seeing himself clearly, maybe for the first time in years. Then perhaps accepting his help isn't just about the money. Perhaps it's about giving him an opportunity to become someone better. Eleanor's voice was tired but certain. Redemption is a gift we give to others as much as to ourselves. If you refuse his help out of pride, you deny him the chance to prove he's capable of good. The words settled into Natalia's heart, like seeds finding fertile ground. She hadn't thought of it that way, that accepting Victor's generosity could be an act of faith, a belief in his capacity for transformation. What if it's a trap? She asked, voicing her deepest fear. What if he wants something in return? Then you will deal with that when it comes, but you cannot live your life assuming the worst of everyone. Eleanor's grip tightened. I taught you languages so you could understand people, connect with them, build bridges. If you wall yourself off from everyone who might disappoint you, you will miss the ones who could surprise you. Natalia stayed at the hospital until Eleanor fell asleep again, then drove home through quiet streets, turning her grandmother's words over in her mind. When she finally pulled into her apartment parking lot, she sat in her car for a long time, looking at the envelope in her hands. She made her decision. The next morning she called Victor Ashworth. Natalia. His voice was cautious, uncertain. I didn't expect to hear from you so soon. I've thought about your offer. I'd like to accept, but with conditions. A pause. What conditions? First, this has to be completely legitimate. I want documentation, a proper grant agreement, everything above board. No favors owed, no expectations beyond what's on paper. That's already arranged. My foundation's lawyers can have everything to you within the week. Second, I want you to understand that accepting this doesn't mean I've forgiven everything. The things you said at the restaurant, they hurt. Words have power, Mr. Ashworth. The languages you speak are weapons or bridges, depending on how you wield them. I understand. Victor's voice was heavy, and I meant what I said about being sorry. Third, Natalia hesitated, then pushed forward. I want you to use your resources to help other people like me, not just once. If you truly want to change, prove it by creating opportunities for others who've been dismissed and underestimated. The silence on the other end stretched for a long moment. When Victor spoke again, his voice was different, softer, almost wondering. You're negotiating with me. I'm a diplomat. It's what we do. A diplomat who serves tables and speaks 7 languages and has more integrity than anyone I've encountered in decades of business. Victor paused. Your conditions are accepted. All of them. Then we have an agreement. Natalia, Victor said before she could hang up, thank you. Not just for accepting, but for the conditions. They're exactly what I needed someone to demand of me. You're welcome, Mr. Ashworth. Victor, please. After everything, I think we've earned first names. Victor, then, and you can call me Natalia. I already do. In my head, at least. He paused. Your grandmother, she raised an extraordinary woman. I hope I get to meet her someday, to thank her for the lessons she taught you that you passed on to me. Maybe you will, if the treatment works. I'm praying it does, and I don't pray often. When she hung up the phone, Natalia sat in her small apartment and allowed herself to feel hope. Real hope, not the desperate kind. For the first time in months, the future seemed less like a weight pressing down on her shoulders and more like an open door waiting to be walked through. 3 weeks later, Eleanor began her experimental cardiac treatment at the finest medical facility in the city. Dr. Chen, who had initially given her months to live, now spoke cautiously about years. Perhaps many years if the therapy continued to work, as well as the initial results suggested. Natalia had reduced her hours at La Fontaine, working just enough to maintain her independence while spending more time at the hospital. Margaret had been understanding, having learned about Eleanor's situation through the staff grapevine. "Family comes first," Margaret had said. "You're one of the best servers we've ever had. Your job will be here when you're ready to come back." Thomas Brennan had become an unexpected friend during these weeks. He visited the hospital once, bringing flowers for Eleanor and coffee for Natalia, and the three of them had spent an afternoon talking about Berlin, about languages, about the strange twists life could take. "Victor asks about you," Thomas mentioned as he was leaving. "He wants to know how Eleanor is doing but feels it's inappropriate to reach out directly. Tell him she's responding well to treatment, and tell him—" Natalia paused, searching for the right words. "Tell him that his gift is being honored. Eleanor knows what he did and she's grateful." "I will." Thomas smiled. "He's changed, you know. Since your confrontation at the restaurant, he treats the staff differently now, not just at La Fontaine, everywhere. He makes eye contact, says please and thank you, remembers names. Small things, but for Victor, they're enormous. Small things matter. They do. I've known him for 30 years and I've never seen him like this. It's like something broke open inside him, and what came out was the person he was always supposed to be, before poverty and fear and ambition turned him into someone else." Thomas hesitated before continuing. "He's also started a scholarship fund for children of service workers to help them get the education their parents couldn't afford. He's calling it the Eleanor Reyes Foundation, if that's acceptable to you." Natalia felt tears prick her eyes. "He's naming it after my grandmother? He said she taught you the values that changed his perspective. He wanted to honor that." Thomas paused. "If it's too much, he can change it." "No." Natalia shook her head. "It's perfect. She'll be so moved." When she told Eleanor about the foundation that evening, her grandmother cried. Not the tears of illness or weakness, but the tears of joy that come when you realize your life has mattered in ways you never anticipated. "A foundation in my name," Eleanor whispered, "for children who need help. Because of you," Natalia said. "Because you taught me that language is a bridge, that every person deserves dignity, that sometimes the most powerful thing we can do is tell the truth." Those lessons changed Victor Ashworth's life, and now he wants to pass them forward. Eleanor was quiet for a long time, looking at the ceiling of her hospital room with an expression of profound peace. "Mija," she said finally, "do you remember what I told you about planting seeds? That sometimes all we can do is plant them and trust they'll grow. This is what I meant. You planted a seed in Victor Ashworth's heart with your courage and your words, and look what's growing." Eleanor smiled. "This is the legacy I wanted to leave. Not money or possessions, but the knowledge that kindness ripples outward, that one act of dignity can transform not just one life, but many. You've given me so much, Abuela. Everything I am, everything I know about language and connection and being human, it all comes from you." "No, Misha, I only watered what was already there. The courage was always yours. The integrity was always yours. I just helped you see it." Eleanor squeezed her hand with surprising strength. "And now you've helped Victor Ashworth see what was inside him too. That's what teachers do. That's what love does. It reveals people to themselves." Natalia held her grandmother's hand as the evening light faded outside the window. The monitors continued their steady rhythm, but something had shifted in the room. A sense of completion, of circles closing, of stories finding their rightful endings. She didn't know what the future held. Eleanor's treatment was promising but uncertain. Victor's transformation was encouraging but untested. Her own path forward remained unclear. Would she return to diplomacy, continue at the restaurant, find some new direction entirely? But in this moment, none of that mattered. What mattered was that she had spoken truth to power, and the truth had taken root. What mattered was that her grandmother was still here, still fighting, still teaching. What mattered was that sometimes, when you least expect it, the people who hurt you become the people who help you heal. And sometimes, the bridges you build with language lead to places you never imagined possible. Outside the hospital window, the city lights were beginning to flicker on, thousands of small illuminations pushing back against the gathering darkness. Each light represented a story, a life, a person carrying their own struggles and hopes. Natalia had learned through her grandmother that language connected all those separate stories, made it possible for one person to truly understand another. That was the gift Eleanor had given her. Not just words in 7 languages, but the understanding that words could change everything, could wound or heal, divide or unite, destroy or create. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. Eleanor's treatment would continue, with its mixture of hope and uncertainty. Victor would face the ongoing work of becoming a better person, and Natalia would continue to navigate the space between who she had been and who she was becoming. But tonight, in this quiet hospital room, everything was exactly as it should be. 1 year later, Natalia stood at the podium of the grand ballroom at the Meridian Hotel, looking out at 500 faces illuminated by crystal chandeliers. Business leaders, philanthropists, educators, and community organizers had gathered for the first annual Eleanor Reyes Foundation Gala, an evening dedicated to celebrating the transformative power of language and dignity. In the front row, Eleanor sat in a wheelchair, her silver hair styled beautifully, her eyes bright with tears of joy. The experimental cardiac treatment had exceeded every expectation. Doctor Chen now spoke not of months or even years, but of decades. Eleanor's heart, like her spirit, had proven far stronger than anyone anticipated. Beside her sat Victor Ashworth, dressed impeccably, but with a softness in his expression that would have been unthinkable a year ago. Thomas Brennan was on his other side, and Margaret Chen had taken the evening off from La Fontaine to attend. David the sous chef was there too, along with Mrs. Patterson from Table 4, and the Henderson family, whose elderly mother had celebrated her birthday at the restaurant the day everything changed. When I was asked to speak tonight, Natalia began, her voice carrying clearly through the microphone, I wasn't sure what I could say that would do justice to my grandmother's legacy. How do you describe someone who taught you that words are bridges, not weapons? How do you honor a woman who showed you that every person deserves dignity, regardless of their job title or bank account or the language they speak? She paused, letting her gaze travel across the room. A year ago, I was serving tables at a restaurant, working to pay for my grandmother's medical treatment. I had a master's degree, spoke 7 languages, had worked as a diplomat, but none of that mattered to the man who sat down at my table and decided I was worth nothing more than his contempt. Victor's expression tightened, but he didn't look away. He spoke German to mock me, assuming I wouldn't understand. He called me stupid, said I would never be anything better than a servant. He used language, that beautiful, powerful tool for human connection, as a weapon to diminish me. Natalia smiled. What he didn't know was that my grandmother had taught me German through bedtime stories and old films. She had taught me that understanding someone's language means understanding their heart. And she had taught me that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is speak truth when everyone expects you to remain silent. She looked directly at Victor, so I responded in perfect German. I told him exactly who I was and what I had accomplished. And in that moment, something extraordinary happened, not to me, but to him. He saw himself clearly, perhaps for the first time in years. He saw the man he had become, and he didn't like what he found. The room was absolutely silent, 500 people holding their breath. What happened next changed both our lives. Victor Ashworth, yes, the Victor Ashworth sitting in the front row, reached out to apologize. He offered to pay for my grandmother's treatment. And when I gave him conditions, that this help must be legitimate, that he must use his resources to help others, he accepted everyone without hesitation. Natalia's voice softened. I learned something important that day. I learned that people are complicated, that the capacity for cruelty and kindness can exist in the same heart. I learned that redemption is possible when someone is willing to face their own reflection honestly. And I learned that my grandmother's greatest lesson, that language builds bridges, applies not just to the words we speak, but to the grace we extend when others stumble. She gestured toward Eleanor. My grandmother is alive today because of a man who once used his words to hurt me. The Eleanor Reyes Foundation exists because that same man wanted to honor the woman who taught me the values that challenged him to change, and I am standing here, speaking to all of you, because I chose to believe that bridges are stronger than walls. Eleanor was weeping openly now, and she wasn't alone. Throughout the ballroom, people wiped their eyes and reached for their neighbors' hands. The foundation we celebrate tonight will provide language education and career support to children of service workers. It will help young people like I once was, bright, ambitious, full of potential, access opportunities they might otherwise never have. It will teach them that their worth is not determined by their parents' jobs or their family's income or the assumptions others make about them. Natalia paused, her eyes finding Eleanor's. But more than that, this foundation carries forward my grandmother's deepest belief that understanding each other is the first step toward caring for each other. When we learn someone's language, we learn their story. When we learn their story, we begin to see their humanity, and when we see their humanity, cruelty becomes impossible. She straightened, her voice growing stronger. To everyone in this room tonight, the donors, the educators, the community leaders, I ask you to carry this message forward. Every day, you encounter people who serve you. Waiters and waitresses, cashiers and custodians, delivery drivers and hotel staff. Each of them has a story you don't know. Each of them has dreams and struggles and people who love them. The way you treat them reveals who you really are. Victor nodded slowly, acknowledging the truth of her words. Be the kind of person who builds bridges. Be the kind of person who assumes the best instead of the worst. Be the kind of person who, when confronted with their own failures, chooses growth over defensiveness. Natalia smiled. Because you never know when the person you dismiss might be the one who changes your life. She stepped back from the podium. Thank you all for being here tonight. Thank you for supporting this foundation and its mission. And thank you, Abuela, for teaching me everything I know about language, dignity, and love. The applause that followed was thunderous. Eleanor was helped to her feet, and Natalia rushed to embrace her, holding her grandmother tight while 500 people cheered. Later, after the speeches were done and the dancing had begun, Natalia found Victor standing alone by the windows, looking out at the city lights. That was quite a speech, he said without turning around. You didn't have to include my story. Yes, I did. Natalia joined him at the window. Redemption that stays hidden isn't really redemption. It's just private guilt. By sharing what happened, all of it, including how wrong you were, you show others that change is possible. I still can't believe I said those things to you. Victor's voice was heavy with lingering shame. When I think about the person I was that day, that person helped build this foundation. That person is funding scholarships for hundreds of children. That person learned to see service workers as human beings worthy of respect. Natalia touched his arm gently. You're not defined by your worst moment, Victor. You're defined by what you do after. Your grandmother told me something similar when I finally got to meet her. Victor smiled slightly. She said that every language has words for forgiveness, but the hardest language to speak is the one where you forgive yourself. That sounds like her. She always knew exactly what to say. She's remarkable. You're remarkable. This whole year has been... He shook his head. I keep waiting to wake up, to discover it was all a dream and I'm still the person I was before you spoke German back to me in that restaurant. You're not dreaming, and you're not that person anymore. Natalia looked out at the city. My grandmother says that growth isn't a destination, it's a direction. As long as you keep moving toward kindness, toward understanding, toward treating people with dignity, you're on the right path. Even when I stumble, especially when you stumble, that's when it matters most to get back up and keep walking. They stood in comfortable silence for a moment, watching the lights of the city twinkle below. Inside the ballroom, the orchestra played a waltz, and Natalia could hear laughter and conversation drifting through the windows. What's next for you? Victor asked finally. Now that Eleanor's treatment is stable, now that the foundation is launched, what do you want? Natalia had been thinking about this question for weeks. I've been offered a position at the United Nations again. Special envoy for cultural affairs. It would mean traveling, using my languages, doing the work I trained for. Are you going to take it? I don't know yet. Part of me wants to return to diplomacy, to feel like I'm making a difference on a larger scale. But another part of me has learned that making a difference doesn't require a fancy title. Sometimes it just requires speaking truth at the right moment. Like you did with me. Like I did with you. Natalia smiled. Whatever I decide, I know one thing for certain. My grandmother's lessons will go with me. Every conversation, every negotiation, every interaction, I'll remember that words can wound or heal, and I get to choose which. Victor extended his hand. Thank you, Natalia, for everything. For your courage, your grace, your willingness to believe I could be better than my worst moment. She took his hand and shook it firmly. Thank you for proving me right. As the gala wound down and guests began to leave, Natalia wheeled Eleanor out to the waiting car. The night air was cool and clear, the kind of evening that felt like a new beginning. Mija, Eleanor said softly, I am so proud of you. I learned from the best. You learned to be yourself. That's the greatest lesson anyone can master. Eleanor looked up at the stars scattered across the dark sky. Your parents would be so proud of you too. They believed in speaking truth, in standing up for dignity, in building bridges between people. You carry their legacy forward every day. Natalia knelt beside her grandmother's wheelchair, taking her weathered hands in her own. I love you, Abuela. Everything good in me came from you. No, Mija. Everything good in you was always there. I just helped you see it. Eleanor smiled, her eyes bright with love and tears. And now you help others see the good in themselves. That's the greatest gift anyone can give. As they drove home through the quiet streets, Natalia reflected on the extraordinary journey that had brought her to this moment. A year ago, she had been a waitress struggling to pay medical bills, confronted by a cruel man who thought his language made him superior. Tonight, she had stood before hundreds of people, honoring the woman who had taught her that language is a bridge to understanding. Victor Ashworth had been transformed from a symbol of arrogance into a partner in building something beautiful. Eleanor's foundation would help countless children access education and opportunities, and Natalia herself had discovered that her worth was never determined by her job title or her circumstances, only by the courage to speak truth and the grace to offer others the chance to grow. She thought about all the people in her life who had played a role in this transformation. Margaret, who had given her a job when she needed it most. David, who had offered quiet friendship in the kitchen. Thomas, who had reached out with genuine kindness. Dr. Chen, whose skill and dedication had given Eleanor more time. And Victor, who had proven that even the hardest hearts can soften when confronted with truth spoken in love. But most of all, she thought about Eleanor, the woman who had raised her, taught her, shaped her into the person she had become. Without Eleanor's lessons about language and dignity and human connection, none of this would have been possible. Without her grandmother's unwavering belief in the goodness that exists in every person, Natalia might have responded to Victor's cruelty with cruelty of her own. Instead, she had chosen courage. She had chosen truth. She had chosen to be a bridge. This is the power of language. This is the power of dignity. This is the power of believing that every person you meet carries a story worth hearing and a heart capable of change. If this story touched something inside you, leave a comment. Sometimes naming what we feel changes more than we imagine. Your comment may help someone who's silently struggling today.